Okay, we are now live. We'll leave everyone a moment or two to join and get the notification on their phones. Always takes a second for everyone to start coming in, and then we can do the introductions. It's been a little while since we've had you on a live stream now. I think it's been a couple of months, hasn't it, at least?
It's about 2 months, yes.
It's good to have you again. I think we've had a great one with Jeffrey as well, and a couple of ambassadors since probably. So we're getting things moving again with this 2023, really.
And you're in one of my favorite topics today, because prisons, how they work or don't work, and the prison system is one of my real interests in life. So I'm delighted to be able to have a conversation about that with you.
Yeah, I have to say I'm quite excited as well. We've been focusing a lot on my projects with police recently, but I know that my remit also covers criminal justice, and I think prisons is an area we definitely need to be talking about more. I'm seeing a couple of people joining us. Hi, Claire. Good to see you. Hi, Donna. Thanks for joining. Please do say hi, everyone, as you come along. It's always nice to know we're not just talking to empty space and actually feel a little bit connected. We will be leaving some time for a Q&A as well. So if you have got any questions, don't hesitate to stick them in the comments. Well, we've got someone from Vancouver Island joining us. Hi, thank you. Got Rob here as well, supporting. Wonderful. We've got some great ambassadors as well who have come to support as usual, but they always bring some great questions as well. So I'm excited to see where that leads us. Okay, well, as we've got a few people here, I think I'll start with some very basic introductions and let us start to get into the live stream gradually. So to anyone who hasn't met me before, hi everyone, I'm Isabel. I'm a psychologist by background, and I'm currently Wave Trust's project manager for police and criminal justice. I've been involved with Wave for over 7 years now in various different capacities, and I'm taking the lead on these live streams at the moment. I'm also joined today by Wave Trust's founder, George Hosking. He's also currently our operations director, and one of the reasons he's here to talk to us about prisons today is because he is actually a clinical criminologist and has been working in and with prisons for 25 years now. So before I pass over to George with the first question, I just wanted to share my slides very, very quickly, because we will be talking about trauma-informed approaches and consequently trauma today. And I just wanted to acknowledge that we might come across a couple of themes that could be triggering for people. We know that this doesn't happen very often, but it is a risk when it comes to talking about such sensitive topics. So we wanted to highlight some things that you can do if that does happen to you. First and foremost, you can really ground yourself in the moment. We find that taking some really deep breaths in and out can make all the difference, and that's often enough for most people to kind of get themselves out of the discomfort. If that isn't, you can also remove yourself a moment for the situation. You know, get up, get a glass of water, stretch your legs for a moment and come back when you're ready. If that still isn't enough, though, and you really do need support, there is plenty of support out there. First of all, in terms of what we can do for you, there is a wonderful peer support network called Hearts of Ace, whose email address is there, and that's peer support network for those with lived experience of trauma. But you can also take down some of the contact details there for this wonderful charity, NAPAC, who supports adult survivors of all kinds of child abuse as well. George, do you have anything to say on that before we quickly go into the questions? I know that you often do this introduction for our trainings.
No, obviously the difference is that I'm quite experienced at supporting people who are having impacts from past trauma. So I'm always available to do that if necessary, but let's hope that doesn't prove the case in the next hour.
Absolutely, and I will be monitoring the comments as well as we go along. So if anyone does need help, please feel free to reach out. I'm seeing lots of new people have joined us as well. So hello to everyone who I haven't flagged up individually. But George, I wanted to kick things off with a really straightforward question to start with, and that is, what do we actually mean by a trauma-informed prison?
A trauma-informed prison is one that assumes that the majority of the inmates coming into care and custody arrive with a history of interpersonal trauma, and recognizing that fact, acts accordingly. All staff are trained to understand how trauma impacts the brain and life outcomes, as well as how to act in a manner that's beneficial to the mental and psychological well-being of their inmates. Also, where possible, the prison's policies, procedures, and practices are geared towards the avoidance of unnecessary stress, to building relationships, showing respect, and ensuring a sense of safety, among other things. I might also say the very critical part of a trauma-informed prison is a strong emphasis on staff mental well-being and awareness of the danger of vicarious trauma for staff members who often have quite challenging or tragic circumstances to face on a daily basis. So that awareness, which is growing within the prison system in the UK, but when I started off in prisons, prison staff had absolutely, even prison psychologists, had no knowledge about trauma or how widespread it was. And that is something that still varies, I find, today, very strikingly between prisons. There are some prisons that are much more aware of this and operate with a sensitivity to it. There are a lot of prisons which show not only no sensitivity to it, but actively, and in some cases even, I'm sorry to say, deliberately, I don't mean the prison itself, but certain staff in the prison increase the stress and negative impact of trauma in the lives of the inmates, which only creates poor relationships between staff and prisoners and greater outbreaks of violence between prisoners.
Thank you, Joe. I think that's quite a good explanation of both sides of the trauma-informed practice, looking at both what I would often call service providers in a multi-agency setting and the staff themselves. I'm seeing a few more people joining us as well, including Jay and Natalie and Debbie, actually. So I just want to say a quick hello to all of our ambassadors who are always supporting us there. But George, I know I've briefly mentioned your background at the start with the introduction, but I was wondering if you could explain in a little bit more detail what your experience is in working both in prisons and with prisons at the moment.
Yes. I chose, when studying criminology, to take clinical criminology, which meant a hands-on experience, and my specialist area is violence. So I was working with violent men, both in prison and after release from prison, with my prime objective being to prevent further violent behavior by them, something in which we've been incredibly successful. And that incidentally includes pedophiles and sexual offenders, sexual violence, as well as more straightforward physical violence. Very early in my work, I discovered that a very high percentage of the violent people I was dealing with had suffered significant childhood trauma. And that childhood trauma had played a major role in the pathway to turning them into violent individuals. But when I talked to the psychologists in the prisons I was working with about that, I'm going back 25 years now, they didn't understand trauma and they didn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder. So far from treating it, they didn't even understand it. And I struggled for some years, actually, trying to bring this issue to the attention of prison authorities without a great deal of success. But fortunately, they did allow me to work in my own way, healing the trauma of prisoners. And I put that down as one of the major reasons why I think I've only ever had one offender that I've ever worked with reoffend with a violent offence, and that was a single offence which he has never repeated. And in fact, he's now somebody who works as a counsellor with violent people, stopping them from becoming violent. But he did spoil my 100% record. So that was the initial work that I was doing. I was doing it with the probation service, I was doing it in the community, I was doing it with the NSPCC, and I was doing it in prisons. Over the years, the issue of trauma is something that we were very aware of in WAVE, of course. And in 2017, the National Police Chiefs Council asked WAVE to run the first ever UK-wide senior management workshop on trauma-informed policing. And after we ran that workshop, we began running workshops for other agencies, including prisons, health service, probation, youth justice, and many others, many of them in criminal justice, but not all of them in criminal justice. And we've been running these trauma-informed workshops now for 6 years. And I'd like to think we do so very successfully. We certainly get extremely good feedback from what we do.
Thank you, George. I just wanted to open it up, I think, before I continue the conversation to everyone in the comments, just to say, if you've got any questions or anything going on, any ideas that are sparked from any of the answers that George is giving, please do stick them in the comments and I'll hopefully highlight them as we go along. We'd love this to be an interactive session as well. It's the joy of the live streams rather than a pre-recorded webinar in a sense. So please do drop anything in the comments there. I think a question that kind of came to mind to me, George, in the meantime, around this was how many settings that we talk about trauma-informed approaches, take schools, for example, or health setting, etc., are often not really inherently traumatic, or definitely don't have to be. Whereas I know that prisons can sometimes be perceived as a place that is automatically at least very stressful. How can we consider the issue of avoiding re-traumatization in that context?
I think it's very important that staff understand what the negative impacts are on the dynamic between themselves and prisoners, and between prisoners and prisoners, when they are re-traumatized. But if they don't even know that they are re-traumatizing people, they're not aware of it. I often tell the story of Paul Mayne, the former police commander for Ayrshire in Scotland, who created the first ever trauma-informed police force in Scotland. And Paul subsequently spoke at one of our WAVE workshops for senior civil servants in Scotland. And Paul opened his speech by saying that in 35 years as a police officer, he had re-traumatized people every single day without realizing he was doing it, simply by following his police training. And many prison officers are re-traumatizing people every day and not realizing that they're doing it. And that's one of the things that we do with our trauma-informed training, is we make people aware of this. And I must say, I'm finding in the prisons that we're working with a very good response from a lot of the people that we're engaging with and training in this way, who recognize what I'm saying, perhaps have not been as aware of it previously as they are after they've received our training. But they're not fighting against it, whereas there was a time when there was quite a lot of resistance to the idea that we should be trauma-informed in how we handle prisoners, from a rather old school view that these are bad people we're dealing with, and the tougher we are with them and the more heavy-handed we are with them, the more likely they are to respect us and do what we tell them to do. Actually, the evidence is completely opposite. The more heavy-handed you are with them, the more likely you are to trigger more violence and bad behavior amongst people.
Yes, I think I can say that that cultural shift is starting to happen across the criminal justice system in different ways. And I think it will be interesting to see how things change as that new perspective becomes a little bit more embedded. I am seeing just a couple of questions in the comments here. So first of all, from Jay, what is the secret to your success?
In a trauma-informed approach, the first key always is to build a relationship with somebody. So when I'm working with violent offenders, I always make it clear that they have to take 100% responsibility for what they've done. I never excuse them, or I never say, you know, it's not something you have to be dealing with the consequences of at a personal level. But I also say that I'm not there to judge them. That I do understand the circumstances, particularly when I hear their circumstances, that have led to them leading lives of violence. And I'm there to help them discover how to lead very different lives with much happier outcomes. And I've often sat in a prison cell and said to someone with all sincerity, you know, if I'd had the childhood that you had and you'd had my childhood, I could be sitting in your seat right now and you could be sitting in mine. So knowing that I'm not being judgmental about them, knowing that I'm fully committed to being there to support them have a very positive and successful life, and that is possible, because many of them do not believe that's possible. And that's a big hurdle to overcome in many cases. And knowing that I'm there to support them, building that relationship is the absolute key. And it's the key to all successful trauma-informed work.
I think on your last point, George, I wonder if it's worth me sharing one of the visuals we prepared beforehand around the trauma-informed principles that really shows relationship at the center there. If you'd just like to explain this in a little bit of, not too much detail necessarily for the whole live stream, but just explain why relationships is really at the center of everything with trauma-informed practice.
Yes, this is the state of Wisconsin was one of the first states in the United States to make a commitment to become an entirely trauma-informed state. And they've created these 10 principles here. But why I love this chart is because it shows the one principle of healing happening in relationships, not only at the center, but intersecting all of the other principles. Because when you look at those principles, communicating with compassion, sharing power, earning trust, embracing diversity, etc., every one of them is built on the basis of having a good relationship with the person you're working with. And again, when I'm training people in being trauma-informed, I often say to them, don't stint the time you spend building relationship at the beginning of your work. Even if you're only going to be with somebody for 60 minutes, spending 10 minutes building relationship rather than jumping into the overt purpose of the meeting is worth doing. Because once you have relationship, you can work miracles with people. Without relationship, it can be very hard to achieve anything. So yes, I really love this Wisconsin chart.
Thank you, George. I'm following that, I've lost track of a couple of the questions, so I'll highlight the most recent one and then go back through to see if I've missed any ones. But from Lynn here, we've got a question about what do you teach prison officers around how to deal with someone if they're kicking off, if they're having that, what we would probably call if they're being triggered in the moment or if they're being aggressive in the moment.
Well, Lynn, strangely enough, it's not that difficult from how a school teacher would handle a school kid who is kicking off. There is a process which we do teach in our training called emotional containment. How you deal with someone who is, in a sense,
sorry,
out of control.
I don't know if it was just for me, but it cut off there for a moment with the audio. I think the internet connection wasn't perfect. Would you mind just repeating that? I cut off where you were saying the name of the intervention.
Okay. So I was saying emotional containment, which is something we teach to school teachers as well as to prison officers or policemen, is a way of handling people who have lost control of their own emotions. And there is a particular technique to supporting people through that kind of situation. It's something that happens very often in prison environments. And the sad thing is that some prison officers who don't know how to handle this actually make the scenario far worse instead of better. So you have to have clear boundaries with somebody as to how they may behave in a situation, but you also have to have an understanding that in that moment, they're not actually operating out of their thinking brain. They're acting out of their limbic system, the brain which was created before all our neocortex and things joined us as human beings, where they're being driven by pure emotion. And if you try and logically reason with them in that situation, it's unlikely to work. So you have to make contact with what's going on for the person emotionally. And that may be just simply asking the person how they're feeling, asking them to describe what's going on for themselves. It may be, and this is a great trick, by the way, if you're ever working with toddlers, but it also works with people in prison, just changing their whole thinking with a surprise question, or suddenly offering them, hey, why don't we have a cup of tea together, or something like that, or let me fetch you a glass of water, or something that just changes the emotional state that the person is in that moment. It's something that does take some practice, but there are many tips that we train people in how to deal with it.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Lynn, for the question. I'm just seeing a couple of supportive comments as well that aren't necessarily questions. So things like the officers receiving training would definitely, you know, see benefits themselves within the workplace. Someone else talking about their own quick experience whilst they were in prison as well, and seeing that the prison officers had been particularly cruel and lacked empathy. So really echoing what you were saying there about the importance of them having this training. We've got another question here from Monique. I'm not 100% clear on what she means, but you might know exactly what countertransference is referring to here. If not, we can ask for clarification in the comments and move on to another question, but I thought I would still highlight it here.
Yeah, it's like a kind of role reversal that can take place in the interaction between the person dealing with a traumatized individual and the fact that the person who's dealing with them may in themselves begin to feel some of the emotions of what is vicarious trauma because of the interaction that's taking place. So yes, staff can and do get re-traumatized. And again, that's something we deal quite directly with in our training for staff, how to deal with that, how to anticipate it. And it's one of the reasons we put a very, very high priority on staff care and staff self-care in a trauma-informed prison or a trauma-informed environment. Because if people aren't taking care of themselves, they don't have the emotional resilience to deal with the things that they're having to engage with the very damaged people that they're in daily contact with.
And I think that's really critical. Of obviously, secondhand trauma has a huge impact on the individual's well-being, but also it then has a huge impact on how well they can do their job and how well they can continue to create those relationships with not just with inmates, but also with their own colleagues as well. So it's definitely something that needs to be kept in mind, I think, when you're starting to take your organization on a journey to become trauma-informed. Let me just have a look here. I've got another question here from Natalie, and I would expand slightly on her question here. It's talking about how recent crises such as the cost of living, lack of resources, etc., increasing some of the violent behaviors in teenagers. And I would include here things like the ripple effects that we're seeing from COVID, from people not having, say, had access to their peers at critical developmental stages. What are some of the impacts that we're likely to be seeing in the next few years of all of these situations we have in the UK at the moment?
There is a huge overlap between mental illness and criminal offending. And just as I mentioned that there are very large numbers of people in prison are suffering from trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a more extreme form of trauma, so the majority of people in prison are suffering some form of mental disorder, from mild anxiety or depression right through to, you know, borderline personality disorder and so forth. COVID and the stresses and strains of the world today have worsened the situation in the communities, and therefore more people are suffering in this way. We certainly know, and WAVE has run workshops on the impact of COVID, which show that there are higher levels of child maltreatment, higher levels of domestic violence, higher levels of people coping with impacts with things like bereavement and so on, more people having lost their employment or sense of security in the world. So all of these create more stress, and more stress certainly does add to violence. Although personally, I don't believe that poverty in itself is a major cause of violent behavior. I think that violent behavior is much more caused by ACEs, by adverse childhood experiences, than by poverty. But there's no question that poverty exacerbates the situation.
Thank you, George. I'm seeing not so much a question, but a comment here by Claire, but I think it's worth highlighting. We've talked, for example, sorry, I realize this covers us completely for a moment, but we've talked about how it can impact violence, how it can impact mental health, but I think also understanding that people struggling with addiction is a really common issue to find within prisons, and understanding how being trauma-informed would help people who suffer with addiction is really, really critical. I don't know if you have any comment on this, George, before I move on, but I thought it was a really insightful addition from Claire there that was worth highlighting.
It's a spot-on comment from Claire. When people get treated as bad people or as hopeless people, or as people who are not worth support and attention, then of course it only makes matters worse. And for a long, long time, that has been the way that a very large part of the criminal justice system, I wouldn't limit it to police at all, it's many lawyers, certainly many judges, and many prison officers have grown up in a culture where that is a more natural way of thinking. And sadly, it's an attitude that is fostered by some of our newspapers in a way that is actually, if only did they but know it, actually increases the very problems that they rail against. But that's because they don't understand the causes. And if you try to deal with a problem by hitting out at the symptoms and not understanding the causes, then you tend not to have very successful outcomes. So as we see in the case that Claire has described, she became less ready to open up and share and talk with people, and therefore form and for our public services.
Thank you, George. You cut out just a little bit at the end there, so I might turn my camera off for just a little bit to see if that helps with the connection. But I wanted to say that I think one of the future live streams we might consider doing is trauma-informed journalism, because I think that is definitely an area that still needs to be looked at and improved in a sense. So just want to keep on the radar, I think.
That would be a very interesting topic, yes.
If anyone's got any thoughts on that, feel free to put it in the comments as well. We can have a look there. I will think I'll leave any other comments to our next section of Q&A and maybe move on to the next stage of the live stream. I'm just going to share now a really powerful video called Step Inside the Circle. And George, please do let me know if there are any technical issues with it in any way. And we're just going to show you the first couple of minutes of this clip. You can see the full video on YouTube afterwards, but it's really, really powerful in showing you the impact of trauma within a prison population. So let me just share screen here.
Sound is good, Isabel.
Thank you.
It's time now, everyone. We're going to do the Compassion Trauma Circle. Is everyone ready to face their past with compassion? Is that a yes? Yeah. While you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, if a parent or other adult in the household often or very often would swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured, step inside the circle. If you often felt that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, step inside the circle. If your family lived in extreme poverty, step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle.
So, as you can see from that video, sorry, I'll show my camera back on, see if that's picked up now again, there we go. I think that is one of the most powerful videos, really showing how trauma impacts prison populations in different ways. If any of the ambassadors in the chat want to share the link for the full video so people can watch that later as well. The rest of the video is very powerful on top of that. But I think that is the part that I really wanted to highlight for today's live stream to get that key message across. I don't know, George, have you got any comments on that video that you think are worth making before I move on to any further questions?
Yes, as a society, we allow far too many, probably 20% or more, of children in society to be significantly abused and neglected. Then when they go to school, we punish them for the behavior that arose because we as a society allowed them to be abused or neglected. Then when they fail at school or get thrown out of school or take up other behavior that is a reaction to deal with the consequences of their childhood abuse and neglect, and a percentage of them end up in the prison system, we punish them yet again for the pathway that they've followed through life. And I'm not saying, I said earlier, I do believe people have to take the consequences of their actions. I think that's appropriate in our society. But I also think that if we do not understand that it's we as a society who are creating a world which is creating the criminals and the drug addicts and the others that are populating our country to far too great an extent, and we don't actually start preventing that at the very beginning, then as a society, we get the world we deserve, which is nowhere near as wonderful or nice or even as rich as it could be. Yet we blame others instead of taking responsibility for changing it ourselves. So yes, I like others, I'm very much moved whenever I watch that video. I've watched it a number of times and but it also touched my heart when I think back to the babies and small children that were allowed still to this day to be abused and neglected and not stopping it.
Thank you, George. I think the question I wanted to kick off the kind of second section of the live stream, if you will, was, can you give us any concrete examples of trauma-informed prisons that have already been trialed and what their kind of successes have been? I've got some visuals, I know, for some examples, but I'd love to hear more broadly from you.
There's a number of American prisons have gone through a process of becoming trauma-informed. And we've got statistics on the outcomes in some of those prisons, which I know because we prepared it in advance. You've got some slides on that we can share. Also a secure probation unit as well, which is basically much the same kind of thing. In this country, there has been for a while a movement in the women's estate to make prisons trauma-informed. Unfortunately, the organization doing that, which is not WAVE, has declined to show any results of the outcomes of their work. So I just don't know how successful they've been. We've invited them to share, offering to share our data as well with them, but they weren't willing to do that. So I can't speak for what results they've had in the women's estate with that. But as you know, Isabel, we're working with a number of prisons now and speaking to a number of other prisons about the possibility of their becoming trauma-informed. And it's too early in the UK to measure the impact of the work that we're doing. But I'm very confident because we see this across trauma-informed schools, hospitals, health services, probation, youth justice, you name it, housing associations, etc. Over and over and over and over and over again, we see stunningly positive results from organizations which become truly and 100% trauma-informed.
Would it be helpful for me to share some of the visuals we prepared earlier?
Yeah, please do.
Let me add that to the screen here.
So this is a women's prison in Massachusetts, which became trauma-informed, and just over a year later, they measured the impact of the changes from becoming trauma-informed. And you can see these figures here, which, you know, we're not talking about 5 and 10% improvements. We're talking about massive improvements. Yeah, if you like to show one or two of the other examples. So this is a prison in Illinois. You may not be able to see the figures, but I can, so I'll read them out to you. Assaults on staff were running at 106 a year in 2017 before they became trauma-informed. After they became trauma-informed, assaults on staff had dropped from 106 to 16. Use of force in inmates was running at 61 a year before they became trauma-informed, was down to 6 a year after they became trauma-informed. And interestingly, we've seen even more powerful figures, which you don't have, from a hospital in Cambridgeshire working with women with borderline personality disorder, where things like rapid tranquilization incidents before they became trauma-informed were running at 60 a year and had dropped to below 6 a year after they became trauma-informed. We've seen the same in housing, we've seen the same in probation, we've seen the same in schools. It consistently, when things are done well, and it's not always done well, but whenever it's done well, the results are, I think the only word to use is stunning.
And we've got a final example here as well, George, that you might want to talk through.
Yes, that's a probation unit secure unit in San Diego. They had 3 units, all running with fairly similar levels of violence and suicide attempts. A new chief came in and turned one of the units into being trauma-informed, while the other 2 still operated as before. And then a year later, they compared suicide attempts in the 2 non-trauma-informed units were running at 15 and 25 a year. In the trauma unit, they were down to 3 a year. Violent incidents in the non-trauma-informed units were running at 14 and 29 a year. In the trauma unit, 0.
Thank you, George. And I just wanted to answer a question in the comments there around what it can mean that we don't necessarily have results in the UK yet that we can refer back to. And I think that I just wanted to clarify that there are all kinds of different factors that might play into that. There might be issues with the funding that didn't fully cover evaluation. It might be changes in leadership staffing during the project that might have thrown off, you know, how it was going. There's all kinds of different factors that can come in. And given the infinite successes that trauma-informed practice is having on a multi-agency level in the UK and the wonderful examples George has just given us in the US, I would be very surprised if we won't soon in the next few years be getting some great evidence for trauma-informed prisons as well here in the UK. And
while those were all American examples, it's a fact of life that in America, there is far more funding provided for research studies than there are in the UK. It's very, very difficult to get funding for research studies in the UK in the same way. Nonetheless, there are UK examples of very powerful impacts in trauma-informed care. And if anyone is interested, if they contact us afterwards, I can show you some of those in areas like hospitals, housing, and schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to see if I can quickly put my email address up there. If anyone has any follow-up questions or wants any further information on what we've been saying today, do feel free to drop me an email and I'll get back to you. That's idawson@wavetrust.org. So if you have got any questions, feel free to get in touch. There's just a couple of questions here, George. There's a little bit of a discussion in the comments around what you were saying earlier about early intervention and prevention. So whilst we have a specific question about what can we do at schools to avoid that kind of longer term journey you were talking about, I would probably also be interested in hearing a little bit more about what we can do for primary prevention as well.
Right, and I'm actually going to take another question I saw in the, and I'll deal with it briefly in the chat function. Somebody's saying what therapies are used that are effective in dealing with trauma. And the two main questions that I have used, two main approaches that I've used, are something called prolonged exposure therapy, which I found to be tremendously effective and very, very quick in its impact. And another one called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which also has evidence of effectiveness, but in my experience it's a much gentler approach, but a very, very much slower approach. It takes much longer to get results with EMDR. There are other effective approaches as well, but those are the two that I personally use, EMDR or prolonged exposure therapy. What can we do in schools? Well, clearly, from 5 years of age onwards, we have a chance to nurture children into a way that deals with their trauma, and indeed nurturing schools is one of the approaches that works very well in dealing with this. So trauma-informed schools, nurturing groups, nurturing approaches in schools, we should be dealing with this, having failed to prevent it in the first place, when children are 5 to 10 years of age, rather than letting it fester until they get to teenage years, when they start to act out and inflict violence on other people in many cases. In terms of basic prevention, well, there is a pathway. Children who have good nurturing, what we call attuned parenting, parents who really understand how to interact in a harmonious way with their child, tend to develop something called secure attachment. And 60 to 65% of the UK population have secure attachment. And those people, generally speaking, live pro-social lives, care for other people, support each other. They're the kind of person who would help you in the street if you were having a problem, or help your car if it broke down, or do that kind of thing. Kindness is actually by far the majority characteristic in our society. Unfortunately, about 35 to 40% of the population develop what's called insecure attachment. And insecure attachment comes when the initial relationship with the parent hasn't been as skilled as it needs to be to create secure attachment. And people with insecure attachment tend to have poorer relationship skills throughout life, and very often higher levels of aggression, higher levels of mental health problems, higher members of entering the criminal justice system, and many other negative outcomes in life. Although some people with insecure attachment can be very successful. I know one who became president of the United States, not mentioning any names, but he wasn't necessarily the best president of the United States. And within that, there's another group with what's called disorganized attachment. It's a subset of the insecure attachment, who tend to be the worst offenders, have the worst levels of mental health problems, highly disruptive in school, even highly disruptive in preschool, and greatly outnumbering statistically what they should be in the prison system. It boils down back to the quality of parenting. I don't blame parents at all for it, because most people parent the way they were parented themselves. There's an intergenerational cycle. As a society, we can break this, and we know how to do it. As you know, Isabel, there's a program called PCPS, Parent-Child Psychological Support, which has cut by half levels of insecure and disorganized attachment in studies in Spain, where it's run for over 20 years, and in Ireland, where it's run for 15 years. And we are actually trialing that in London at the present time. So we know methods that could produce very much better child outcomes with far less damage to children. It's about supporting parents, not blaming parents, supporting parents.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say around the parent-child psychological support that you mentioned, George, there is actually a briefing on our website under the resources section for anyone who's interested in finding out more. So do look into that if that's an area of interest. Now, there is one question I think that is really important to answer before we move on, George, and that is, how can people make a difference other than speaking with counsellors and MPs? What can people be doing to put pressure on prisons and schools to become trauma-informed?
Well, there's no doubt that speaking to your counsellors and MPs is one of the ways to make a difference. The more that counsellors and MPs ask questions of the prison minister, for example, or the Secretary of State for Education, or the Secretary of State for Justice, about what is happening to become trauma-informed, the better. And be careful, because you will tend to get very pat answers, which are usually written by civil servants. So the good news is that the Ministry of Justice has actually specified that all new prison officers have to understand trauma-informed approaches. I mean, that is a huge, huge breakthrough that has been accepted. It's not yet come to the police through the Home Office. However, the vast majority of people in prisons have not been trained in how to be trauma-informed. And until we do that, even newly trained officers, assuming they've been well trained, and I have no idea what training they're receiving, but even assuming they've been well trained, if they're stepping into a culture which is exactly the opposite as a new prison officer, it can be very difficult to make a difference there. So we need to make it, I mean, it's prison governors who should be being required to ensure their prison is trauma-informed, not newly appointed prison officers aged 18 who've come straight out of school and are going into a prison with no life experience to handle situations, which sadly is happening a great deal with the prison service at present.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Lynn, for the great comment. I think I just wanted to say on there, you triggered another thought for me, that we're talking a lot about the training of officers and training of staff, and that is absolutely where we need to start to create trauma-informed prisons. But part of the longer-term journey to becoming fully trauma-informed will also be making sure that inmates have some information on trauma, have some information on how their lives are likely to be impacted by that, and having that be a culture within the prison of understanding why that has happened. I think that is going to be absolutely key to the rehabilitation side of prisons' roles.
Very good point, Isabel. When we worked with groups of people in prison who were violent and who, very interestingly, initially really didn't believe there was any alternative to being violent within their communities. And I've even had one of them offer to train me in violence because he felt he just understood violence so much better than a criminologist possibly could do. But actually, once we showed them that we really understood the pathway which had led them to becoming violent, but also could sketch out for them the future pathway of what their lives would look like if they continued to be violent, they changed completely and became totally committed and wedded to being non-violent. And with that one exception, everyone that we've successfully completed our program has stayed free from violence ever since.
Thank you, George. I realise we don't have much time left, so I'll move on to some of the questions we did want to make sure we covered. I think this is quite an interesting one, George. What are 2 key things that you think prisons don't currently understand, but that they probably should?
One of the most critical things to understand about people with trauma, and I particularly see this in violent men, is that when they are triggered, i.e. something happens that creates in their body the emotional state of the original trauma that they first suffered, they revert to the emotional age of the child they were when that trauma took place. So that the person, in the instant of being set off, ceases to be an adult and actually at an emotional and behavioral level is being a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old. And they don't know it. They still think that they're an adult. They have adult bodies. Some of them have very frightening, big, powerful adult bodies. Yet they're being driven by the emotional awareness of a 3-year-old. This makes them very dangerous. And in some cases, sadly, lethally dangerous in these situations. If prison officers don't understand that, or police officers or other people dealing with traumatized people, and the same is true in schools, then you just do not know how to handle the person, especially if you're trying to use reason to deal with somebody who is like a 3-year-old having a tantrum, because that's not what usually works with 3-year-olds having tantrums. I can say, being not only a parent of 3 children, but a grandparent of 7 children, and having plenty of experience of the challenging periods of toddlerhood. So that's one of the things, is really understanding how in many circumstances you're dealing with someone who's not an adult, they're a child in that moment. The other thing is that the trauma that somebody gets triggered with doesn't simply have the power of the incident that has triggered them. A series of traumas in a person's life become locked in their body. Something we haven't talked about in this conversation, Isabel, is that trauma is actually something that gets locked in people's bodies. And that's why cognitive behavioral therapy, which I do use and I'm fully trained in, and I use it within my healing work, but on its own, it is not sufficient to heal trauma. I do not believe you can heal trauma simply with CBT. You need to do body work to heal people with trauma. And getting into the body, understanding where in the body the trauma is, and releasing that trauma from the body, which EMDR and prolonged exposure therapy can do, is essential to create that healing process. But you have to understand that you're not just dealing with one trauma, you're dealing with, we call it a stack attack. It's like a whole series of bricks set on top of each other from an original trauma that might have happened when someone was, 3, 8, or 11 years of age, through a series of events that have happened ever since then, to a current day trauma that when it gets set off, the energy, it's like a volcano erupting. It's like all the energy of all these past events comes out in the moment. And I was a business manager before I became a criminologist for decades. I'm very old, by the way. And in my decades as a business manager, I've seen business managers have these stack attacks and behaving in quite bizarre and unacceptable manners, because they had become effectively an adult with the body of a child driving their behavior. And you certainly see it in schools, and you can see it at a bus stop, you can see it on a bus or on a train or anywhere. And sadly, I know the relatives of people who are dead simply because they did not know how to handle a situation with someone that they were trying to reason with, and all they did was re-trigger the person and ended up getting stabbed to death as a result. So I think every citizen should be trained to understand trauma. It can save your life.
Thank you, George. So those are definitely 2 really key messages for prisons. So kind of understanding how development can really be frozen as an effect of trauma, and that impact of stack attacks. I think we often talk about behavior seeming not having a reason behind it. And I think that explanation of stack attacks is something that not only needs to be understood in prisons, but needs to be understood in the everyday population. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we have got time to answer Rob's question, which I think is quite an important one before I move over to the final part. Rob is talking about being made to feel like an ex-prisoner for the rest of his life. And there's wondering if there's anything that can be done in the wider communities, for example, employment and education, so that experience as a prisoner is seen as a blip rather than it being a continuous discussion and becoming something that you're constantly held accountable for. I'm just going to hide that comment because it's so long. If you had a moment to read it over, George.
Yep, I've read it and I can see it in the chat function anyway.
No worries, no worries.
Yes, Rob. We should have, and this is maybe where the trauma-informed journalism needs to come in, we should have people understand that those who are offending, to a very large extent, are people who have been through traumatic childhoods, terrible childhoods. Yet as a society, we express great grief and sadness and upset when we hear stories of children being abused. Yet when those same children go on to act out the consequences of their abuse on society, we, in every way imaginable, denigrate them and call them all kinds of names and treat them in a very bad way. Now, again, I'm sorry to repeat myself. I still hold to my belief that people have to be held accountable for their actions. I know, Rob, that you've been held accountable for your actions in life, and you've served your time, and you have totally reformed. Indeed, I know the work you do helping other people deal with their past trauma and addictions and so forth. So you're doing wonderful work in your local society in Devon at the moment. And that's what we should be looking at, is the wonderful person that Rob Robinson is in 2023, not what Rob Robinson did in 1986. As a result of what I happen to know, Rob was an unbelievably extreme example of abuse and neglect as a child. So yes, we should be training everyone to understand that it's we society who allow children to be damaged, and we society should be taking responsibility for that. And while the individual must accept the consequences of their actions, because if we don't have consequences for actions, you open a Pandora's box to all manner of unacceptable behavior. Even so, the way we deal with people who've served their time should be that they're given a chance to rehabilitate and show that they can be as they can be. And the people I've worked with in prison, some of them can be and have become quite wonderful examples of pro-social human beings and very deeply caring human beings. And sadly, we tend to write people off without recognizing that potential.
Thank you, George. I think that's a really crucial question to end the Q&A on, in a sense. So thank you, Rob, as well, for sharing that question. I wanted to wrap up today's session looking at what WAVE is doing currently to support prisons. Before I do that, I think it's important to say, I know a lot of people have been interacting in the comments and asking lots of questions about areas that aren't necessarily limited just to prisons. It might be in terms of some of the healing around trauma, it might be around prevention, it might be around schools, etc. So if you are looking for further information around WAVE, we do have a website, www.wavetrust.org. So please do have a look on there to see if there's any information, and if there isn't, you can always drop us an email and get in touch, and we're happy to fill you in on any more details there. I also know that, as we've seen, we've had some wonderful examples in the comments of people with lived experience, not only of trauma, but of the experience of prison. We do currently have a wonderful peer support network for anyone with lived experience of trauma called Hearts of ACE, or Hearts of Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I just wanted to leave their email address there for anyone who wants to reach out and get in touch and get involved. So that's heartsoface@wavetrust.org. But George, I wanted to finish today with one final question, and that is, could you tell us a little bit more about what we're doing currently within WAVE to support prisons? What are we currently offering prisons out there who might be interested in becoming trauma-informed?
Firstly, of course, we are offering training to any staff, or indeed, ideally all staff, because successful organizations which have become trauma-informed and produce the kind of results that we were looking at earlier all tell us that it is really important that 100% of the staff in an organization receive training in how to become trauma-informed. That if you only train a proportion of your staff, or only train those who have direct contact with prisoners, for example, but you don't train your prison governors, etc., or your HR department in a trauma-informed approach, the culture just doesn't become embedded. So we do offer that training. We also offer consultancy to help people understand how to shift your organization, because becoming trauma-informed is a culture change more than anything else. It is about a fundamentally different way of interacting, not only with your service users or your inmates or whatever you like to call them, but also with your staff, because there is widespread trauma among the staff of prisons as well as among the inmates in prisons. And that trauma is only made worse by the day-to-day experiences that they tend to have in dealing with the inmates. But also, WAVE's built its reputation. Indeed, the word WAVE stands for Worldwide Alternatives to Violence, in tackling violent behavior. So we are experts in how to address violence. We've been advisors to every one of the Labour Conservative coalition governments in the UK on tackling violence. Sadly, a lot of our recommendations have been accepted and then not put into practice. So there's a big gap between what people say, yes, that's a great idea, and then actually it doesn't get done because of funding arguments or other priorities or changes of prime minister or whatever it might be. But we are very adept in working with organizations of every type, whether it's schools or youth justice organizations or probation services or whoever, in how to deal with violence. So dealing with violence inside your prisons, whether it's inmate on inmate violence or inmate on staff violence or whatever it may be. We've worked with gangs, particularly in London. We've worked with gangs in London on issues of violence. So those are the main areas that we work in with prisons, is tackling violence and trauma-informed culture change.
And I just wanted to say, George, on the trauma-informed culture change, actually, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback, so I'll mute you for just a second. We also have an organisational self-assessment tool if you've already somewhat started the journey to becoming trauma-informed, which allows you to take kind of a current snapshot of your level of trauma-informed practice across all areas. So that might be the staff training, it might be commissioning, recruitment, the physical environment. There's all kinds of elements that change when you do take a full paradigm shift into becoming trauma informed. So we also have that tool to be able to inform you on where you are so far and where you might want to be heading in next steps to becoming trauma informed.
Thanks, Isabel. And yes, of course, that is a particularly valuable tool in creating action plans and setting priorities. And we are working with, for example, Devon and Cornwall Police in the southwest of England, and we're working with 18 separate agencies, including one prison in Hampshire, around measuring organizational progress and becoming trauma-informed. So yes, if anybody's interested in that, we'd be delighted to have a conversation. Isabel
yes.
will probably give you her email address in a moment.
Yes, I was just going to share a little screen there to say, if you do want any further information, both on the trauma-informed side and in tackling violence, you can drop me an email at idawson@wavetrust.org as the project manager for police and criminal justice. You're also welcome to email George in his capacity as operations director. That's ghosking@wavetrust.org, but he is likely to be far busier than I am in terms of monitoring emails. So I would suggest emailing me or emailing us both. I've also put our phone number on our slide there, so if you want to get in touch with Wave, just to get an idea of what we can provide, feel free to get in touch. I'll leave that up for just a moment longer, and I will also add a banner at the bottom there again if you want to check out our website for any further information there, not just related to prisons but also related to prisons. That's www.wavetrust.org. So George, have you got one final remark to close today off? What is one key message you'd like people to take away from today's live stream?
I just repeat the advice I gave earlier, that relationships, good relationships, are the key to successful trauma-informed work. I do find that very often when we work with organizations, they say to us, I don't have time to create relationships. So how can I become trauma-informed? And I've hardly got any time now to answer that question. We even train GPs to become trauma-informed. GPs who have 7 minutes with people. And what we will say to them is, spend the first 2 minutes creating relationship. And then when you've done that, you will get far more results out of the remaining 5 minutes than you will if you just launch into looking at your screen and talking to someone about their symptoms and not actually creating a relationship with them in the first place. Creating those relationships, same in schools with children, same in prisons with inmates or wherever it may be, or same in prisons with the staff that you work with. If you don't have relationships, you struggle to get results. With relationships, with good relationships, amazing results are possible.
Thank you, George. And I think my final key message will be that sometimes it can seem like there's no time to put into a long cultural shift or a paradigm shift or into training new staff, etc. But actually what we tend to find is if you're spending all of your time just putting out fires, you are always going to be putting out fires. Being able to think of this in longer term is absolutely how you are going to survive often infinite demand and staffing challenges and many other things that we know are currently plaguing the prison system. So I would say, even if it's difficult, this is something that you should be considering a priority in one way or another. And as George said, it's that difference between spending 2 minutes properly on relationships and getting better results than spending more time and getting less out of it. But thank you absolutely everyone for coming along. There's been some wonderful engagement today in the comments as well, so thank you. George, thank you so much for finding the time to come on today. I think this has been a really valuable session, but I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Right. Thank you to all of you for participating and your great chat comments. Thank you. Sorry we couldn't answer every one of them.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.